on the insurance crisis in the state of California. Our next speaker is Rex Frazier, the president of the Personal Insurance Federation of California. We're taking a look at the insurance industry, overview of California insurance market and recent changes to California insurance policy. Welcome, Rex. Thank you so much for joining us and appreciate your presentation.
You bet. Hi, Mr. Gaines. Hi, everyone else. I think my goal today, as staff outlined it for me, is to describe the progress or lack of progress, the status of implementation of the Commissioner's sustainable insurance strategy and the issues we see. The sustainable insurance strategy really had four components. One was the pace of approval times when a company seeks to make a rate change, whether it's up or down, to make a rate change request with the Department of Insurance. Those times had been lagging, certainly slowing down over the years. Two was what to do about even when a company gets through the process, the amount of rate that they're permitted to take does not permit them to do the things that policymakers want them to do, which is to serve higher risk areas, but companies have had a difficult time getting the full extent of their rate increases, which then leads to filing an immediate follow-up rate increase, which then burdens the staff with too many filings. Third, what to do about the FAIR plan, which really has become a threat to the orderly operation of the market. And then lastly, I heard Member Lieber earlier talking about transparency and public participation. We have no issue with public participation. That's a fundamental part of Prop 103. But certainly the type of public participation we've received with what are the requirements that they're held to. We have the most transparent rate review process in the nation, so it's unclear to me. I'm happy in Q&A to talk it through, but it's unclear to me what additional amount of participation Member Lieber is seeking. So on those four items, on the first issue, which is the rate approval time, that's where we are seeing really the least amount of progress. So as part of the sustainable insurance strategy, the Commissioner acknowledged that the current part of Prop 103 that deals with approval times is not working. What Prop 103 says is that any rate filing not approved within 60 days shall be deemed approved. And so carriers had an expectation of, okay, that's fine, there'll be price controls, but at least the price controls will not take too long. Well, that's not the way Prop 103 worked out. When companies would get to day 59 and expect an approval by day 60, the Department of Insurance has a routine legal document that they make companies sign waiving their rights to a 60-day approval. And if the companies don't agree to waive their rights to a speedy approval, the Department of Insurance has a policy of just saying, well, fine, we're going to send you to rate litigation. That's going to be worse than if you had just waived your rights and worked with us. So we look at that and say neither one of those options is good, waiving your rights promised under the law or going to hearing. Those are both bad. And so the sustainable insurance strategy takes a look at that and says, well, fine, we don't functionally have a 60-day deemer rule anyway. And so the Commissioner issued a bulletin saying on day 60, if a filing is not done, the Department of Insurance would outline what issues are open with the rate filing, what issues are closed, and what issues, if they're open, what's the department's position. If the department's not done by day 90, that process repeats. If the process is not done by day 120, then under the bulletin that the Commissioner announced, not only will the Department of Insurance issue its status memo, but they'll also issue an offer to the company of what under their then analysis of the rate filing would they be willing to approve? What would be a safe number that if the company wanted to accept it, the matter would be over? Or if they wanted to say, no, that's not sufficient, then you would go another 30 days and that process would repeat. So the commissioner put that bulletin out, which the insurers were excited about. However, it's coupled with a new sort of data reconciliation tool that the Department of Insurance is going to implement to make sure that when a company makes a filing, all the data across all the different spreadsheets gets reconciled. And so the 60-30-30 process doesn't kick in until that data reconciliation and submission portal is done, and the Department of Insurance indicates they think by the end of 2025 that portal, that technology project will be done. So at least on the first element of rate approval time improvement, it looks like we're waiting until the end of 2025 for that improvement. In the meantime, the Department of Insurance did change its definition of what would be a so-called complete rate application, which is used in the language of Prop 103. And we had advocated for a very clear list of these are the documents you have to submit. This is the data that has to be in those documents. Give us a clear indication of what complete means. However, the regulations the department put forward, they actually make it murky and allow the department to just add new things that are not traditionally even included as an element of a rate filing. So it's unclear to us what the purpose of that is, but now the department would be able to hold an application in what's called intake, meaning it doesn't even hit public notice. The 60-30-30 clock wouldn't even start running because the Department of Insurance could just add new filing requirements as it sees fit that are otherwise undefined in the regulations. And if a company wouldn't give that information, then your filing doesn't move forward. So unfortunately, on the first element, the 60-30-30 bulletin was good. Implementation of data portal is probably going to lag, and the complete rate application definition certainly is a step backward. On the second element, which is what are the substantive standards for rate approvals, meaning what's the formula, the two issues that folks have typically talked about are the use of modeled losses rather than looking backward. The way the system works now is when a company wants to project its future wildfire losses, it must look at its average wildfire losses paid over the last 20 years. We don't understand why, in a world where we're regularly talking about a hotter, drier future, why companies would have to look back over the average of the last 20 years to project their forward-looking wildfire losses. And so as a result, we certainly have been among many who have advocated for updating these tools to allow forward-looking models to be used. They're used in every other state, and they're used in California for earthquake loss projections. So it's not as if this issue where people talk about black boxes, you know, if they're that uncertain, why has the California Earthquake Authority, a government entity, been using forward-looking models, you know, for the last decade? No one seems to say there's a problem with that or that they're a black box they can't deal with. And so we look at this and say, well, the government uses forward-looking models for the CEA. Every other state allows insurers to do this. Why shouldn't the California insurance industry do the same? So the commissioner, the career staff has been very diligent on these model regs. There's an advanced draft out for public comment, and you know, it's our hope at least that element of the sustainable insurance strategy would be finalized by the end of the year. There's still a lot of questions about that process. There's a component of the model reg that says use of models. Models have to go through a model review process. The acronym is PRID, P-R-I-D. A model must go through the PRID process before a company could then use that model in its rate filing. The department's advertising for the PRID czar, who's going to be the model reviewer. So that hire, I don't think, has been made yet. And then modelers or companies that use their own in-house models, they'll have to be subjected to that PRID process that does include an opportunity for public comment and, I believe, intervention. And so how long that PRID process is going to take, that's unclear. But there's been a lot of advancement, at least on the rules for the use of models and forward-looking loss projections. On reinsurance, the department had a stakeholder meeting with industry and advocates probably a month ago. They've started meeting with companies on technical issues. It looks as if they're poised to issue a proposal within the next month on reinsurance, and signs are promising so far that they're using a relatively sophisticated mechanism for figuring out what a company's reinsurance cost should be in a rate filing. So cautious optimism there. Now recall in the CIS that use of models and reinsurance is only allowed in exchange for a company maintaining, as Senator Allen was discussing earlier, maintaining their market presence in distressed areas is the language that the commissioner uses. The department has finalized a list of what would be distressed areas, and now there's just technical details for how companies would calculate their market share in these distressed areas. There's some data elements I think they're working through. And so the department put a lot of work into that, and I think they came up with the best you can do when there's so many countervailing considerations there. So overall, there's a lot of progress that it's possible by the end of the year, the rules for the rate formula could be done. It seems as if they're on a track to be no later than end of January of next year is my guess. But I think they're pushing hard. They're under the career staff's under an obvious lot amount of pressure. So I think they're trying to do it by the end of the year, but there's just a lot of complicated details. On the FAIR plan, the department signed a stipulation with the FAIR plan and included in their plan of operation rules for the amount of surplus of an insurance company that could be at risk in any given year from a FAIR plan assessment if the FAIR plan were to run out of money. And that was $1 billion a year that is now totally on the hook, that insurance companies can be assessed up to $1 billion a year each year for FAIR plan uncompensated or for FAIR plan liabilities that they don't have adequate capital for. And so certainly that's in the FAIR plan of operation. We would certainly argue it should be in a regulation as well, not just in the FAIR plan of operation. That the legal status of that is certainly less clear than if it was a statute or a regulation. And then lastly, on public participation, it has been a long frustration of ours that we get relatively cookie cutter objections by intervener groups to rate filings that do not contain application-specific complaints. They just copy and paste arguments from previous documents. And in that first 45 days when they have to intervene, there's no real work shown in their intervention document. And so it looks as if the Department of Insurance has finally at least started requiring interveners to put application-specific arguments in their documents and making sure that they actually do non-duplicative work to the Department of Insurance. We see a lot of interveners claim credit for all the work that they've done, but in our opinion, most of the time it's just duplicating what the Department of Insurance is already doing, and honestly cheapens the work of the Department of Insurance by suggesting that the only reason why there would be a change to a rate filing is because of an intervener. That's just simply not true. So that's the status of things. As soon as the regs are done, I think the burden will shift from us waiting on the Department of Insurance to do the regs to seeing how the insurers react, and we look forward to taking that next step. So maybe I'll stop there unless you want me to keep yammering. I'm happy to, but that's the overall update.
Oh, that's great. Thank you, Rex. Very much appreciated. Could you, given what you've just described, could you project when do you think we will see a stabilization of the insurance market in terms of these price increases that we're all experiencing?
The price increases, That's a tough one. Obviously, inflation is starting to have a lower rate of increase, which is helpful because remember, as inflation of labor and home materials goes up, the amount of insurance people have to buy goes up. The amount of policyholder protection funds that companies have to have goes up, which means they typically have to buy more reinsurance. So inflation makes not only people have to buy more insurance, but it makes insurance companies under the solvency rules have to arrange for more claims paying capacity, which means an additional reinsurance expense. So, as the rate of increase of inflation begins to come down, that will certainly be helpful. The reinsurance market certainly is starting to tame a little bit, but over the last 3 years, it's been very difficult. I think the biggest undiscussed issue when it comes to the rate increases, the historically large rate increases that we see companies requesting, is that no one talks about the really 10 years prior to this administration, when companies were largely not permitted to increase their property insurance rates. So we wouldn't be seeing these giant rate increases if we just had an orderly process for the previous decade. So I do have some sympathy for this administration, coming into a situation where there had been largely flat insurance rates over the previous decade. We were in a low inflation environment, so you wouldn't expect the rate increases to be huge. But there really wasn't, the Department of Insurance had a policy under the Jones administration of largely not granting property insurance increases. And in fact, in 2013, they actually tried to force State Farm rates downward and ordered them to refund $75 million of so-called excess premiums collected. That matter was litigated for 5 years, and ultimately State Farm completely prevailed, where courts found that the Department of Insurance wrongfully suggested a rate decrease was in order when a rate increase was actually in order in 2013, and they concluded that the Department of Insurance had no authority to order a rebate. So while we had Commissioner Jones regularly telling us about the perils of climate change and hotter, drier future, he somehow didn't see fit to realize that, well, if we're going to have a hotter, drier future with more losses, that's going to take more resources in the system. That means higher premiums, but he simply refused. And we never understood the disconnect there, where he would talk about the perils of climate change, but then not allow rates to rise. That was an unforced error. And so by the time we got to 2017 and we had the huge fires in both Northern and Southern California, and then we had a repeat in 2018, companies were already in a deep hole. Whereas if companies just had, like every other consumer good or service, the ability to gradually increase their rates over time, as every business does, we would not be in this situation today.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Now I'd like to look to the board members in terms of comments.
Thank
Member
you.
Vasquez.
Thank you, Chair Gaines. First of all, thank you, Mr. Frazier, for your comments and your presentation. I'm just trying to understand this rate issue, and maybe you can kind of walk me through it here. When I'm thinking about policyholders that live in wildfire zone versus those that don't, is there like a two-tier system, or are they working on something similar to that?
In terms of, so when a company goes to the Department of Insurance, what they're requesting is a statewide average rate increase. So if you see a news article that company X is asking for a 15% increase, that doesn't mean if granted everybody is going to get a 15% increase. It means from there you go to the second step of figuring out how a particular risk would either be charged higher or lower than the average. And so is your question that everybody should pay the same rate regardless of home construction or proximity to brush or trees? Or I'm trying to understand what you're seeking.
For example, I think you kind of touched on it. For example, somebody, let's say, lives in a fire zone. I'm thinking even in Southern California, like in the Riverside, the mountains of Riverside, right? For example, or the San Bernardino Mountains. versus somebody on the west side of LA that's not in the fire zone?
Yeah, so I think a big misconception that you see a lot of people use imprecise language is, remember, a rate increase doesn't look at any home characteristic at all. A rate increase is a calculation under the Department of Insurance's regulations of what the department will allow for an aggregate statewide premium collected. So it doesn't look at any particular home. It looks at, given the insurance company's expense structure and there's various elements in the rate formula, what is the amount of money the company is permitted to collect on a statewide basis? So that's what a rate filing is. It has nothing to, the rate filing itself has nothing to do with or homeowner specific considerations. Then once you have your rate approval, you have a second element, which is then the use of, in our world, they talk about segmentation models or risk models, but they look at what will happen when you start looking at individual homes. And so there's various vendor tools, or certain companies are big enough to have their own methodologies, but take the longest, sort of the incumbent in the market is called Fireline, and Fireline has a methodology for looking, analyzing where a home is, and it produces a score, in that case from 0 to 30. And then depending on what the score is, that will, if it's a low score, someone will pay less than the average. If it's a higher score, they'll pay more than the average. And so typically what the Department of Insurance has done is, as those scores have gotten higher and higher, they've pushed the rate of increase to be flatter and flatter. So we already have in the system today a subsidy that's embedded in the premiums that people are paying, where the higher you go up the rate or the risk score ladder, you pay a relatively smaller increase. That's already the way it works today. But certainly there is a formula, instead of it just being like a 45-degree angle where you just go up as the risk increases, it'll go up and then start to flatten a little bit. And that's a public policy decision that the Department of Insurance has made. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, well, I think you helped me out a little bit there now, because I was thinking more it was a blanket, but it isn't. It sounds like they make, even though I guess the initial rate increase is kind of a statewide blanket without taking into consideration where you live, and then it gets into more specifics by the companies moving forward.
Step two is really how you allocate that permitted premium across the policyholder base. And it's that step two where you start looking at building materials, and do you live close to a slope, because fire behavior is more difficult if you live near hills. What's the amount of brush, the type of brush, the concentration, what's the access for firefighters to get in there? Those sorts of considerations then are used by carriers to determine whether they would charge above or below the average.
Thank you. And just last question, when you touched a little bit on the FAIR plan, is there a FAIR plan for landslides and earthquakes? And how did that insurance industry handle, for example, the 1994 Northridge earthquake, which was worth, I think it was upward to like $40 billion?
There's no FAIR plan for landslide. That's an uncovered peril, and it's devastating when it happens to an individual. Now, for earthquake, we do have a standalone facility. I started working at the Department of Insurance 2 weeks before the Northridge earthquake, so it was quite an eye-opening experience for me as a young staffer at the Department of Insurance, where one company, 20th Century, they had they were a big writer in the San Fernando Valley in the property insurance market, and they clearly were writing without focus on being over concentrated, because concentration risk is really what took down the company you all were talking about earlier, Merced Property and Casualty. They shouldn't have had so many policies concentrated in one area, and when the worst scenario happens, it took a company down. That was a good long time. I think they have a 75-year-old company, so they were a good company. 20th Century, I believe they lost, it was a staggering number, like 24 years of premium in those 50-some seconds of the Northridge earthquake, and they were functionally insolvent. and the department ultimately had to go through an auction process to save that company. And so in 1995, the legislature looked at what they should do. They passed some reform legislation, but it didn't really fix the market. It wasn't until 1996 that when escrows started to slow or not be able to close, that you started to see momentum where the legislature created the California Earthquake Authority, which exists to this day. And so when a company sells a homeowner's insurance policy under California law, they must offer someone earthquake insurance. And companies can choose, as a way to satisfy that mandate to offer, to join the California Earthquake Authority. In order to join the California Earthquake Authority, a company has to pay an entry fee. And so I want to say in the original CEA legislation, there had to be a total of $740 million put into the CEA before it took off. When they reached that threshold, the CEA was launched, and to this day, it has almost $20 billion of claims paying capacity reserved for earthquakes. And so we would have to see a string of at least a couple Northridges in a row and maybe a 1906 San Francisco quake on top of it. So it's well capitalized, but it's had many years to grow, and the CEA has what companies don't have. The CEA, because it's a governmental entity, they don't have to pay income tax. So all of their premiums grow tax-free, whereas obviously that's not the case for private companies.
Thank you.
Yes, Chair Lieber, excuse me.
Thank you. It's good to see you again, Mr. Frazier. Thank you for coming back for a second visit with us. And I was trying to take notes as quickly as I could from what you were saying, but you made some comments at the beginning about the FAIR Plan being disruptive to the market in California.
Yeah.
And can you go into that a little bit more?
You bet. The FAIR Plan was formed in the late 60s and really was a market of last resort for individuals and small business commercial policyholders. And over the history of the FAIR Plan, up until really the last 5 or 6 years, it really has been the 5 big Southern California counties that have used the FAIR Plan. And it hasn't, so you have traditional brush areas, let's say in Malibu, that's been a FAIR Plan community for a pretty long time. Other brushy areas in Riverside, San Bernardino Mountains, places like that. But it was really limited to the 5 Southern California big counties, and it was really small business, commercial oriented as well. And so it's only been, and so the FAIR Plan represents an entitlement to fire insurance, and in particular for the standard form fire policy that satisfies mortgage lender requirements. And so anyone who needs a mortgage, if they have to go to the FAIR Plan, you should never want to go to the FAIR Plan, but if it's your only option, you have the ability to get a full fire policy that satisfies Fannie and Freddie and that's subject to Department of Insurance rate controls, the same method under Prop 103. It pre-existed Prop 103, but the Department of Insurance still uses the Prop 103 rate template for looking at the rates that the FAIR Plan is allowed to charge. Now, the FAIR Plan, there's no government backing of it. It's not a government program. It's a legislative created private program. So when you get your license as an insurance company, you are forced, as a condition of getting your certificate of authority to write insurance in California, you are forced to join the FAIR Plan. And so the statute calls it a non-voluntary private association of insurance companies. And so every company, they have to back up the FAIR Plan if the FAIR Plan runs out of money. So the FAIR Plan has its income sources, the premiums they charge people, and any investment income that they're able to derive. But remember, under Prop 103, the more investment income you make, the lower rates you charge. The lesser investment income you make, the higher rates that you charge. So that's specifically covered in Prop 103. That the mathematical influence of investment income be included in consideration of a permissible rate. But what happens when the FAIR Plan runs out of money? Well, it's not like the government rides to the rescue. If the FAIR Plan's $1 billion short after a big fire, they turn to the insurance industry. And they say, well, State Farm, you write 21% of the market, pay us $210 million out of your surplus. Oh, by the way, you have a bunch of claims related to this same fire. So while you're considering those, also still write us a check for $210 million. So the historical resting point of the FAIR Plan has been around 120, 130,000 policies on a statewide basis. That's been where it's been for decades. Now it's over 400,000 policies, right? So now you're getting to the point where you could have massive FAIR Plan shortage of claims paying ability, massive assessments to be levied on insurance companies. And so what do you do in that circumstance? Do we really want to let the FAIR Plan bankrupt the insurance industry? So how do we handle that situation? So that's certainly the existential risk that the FAIR Plan poses. Did that answer your question?
Partially. I mean, the alternative to having a FAIR Plan that does have that relationship with the for-profit providers would just be like letting an enormous number of Californians go bare with no insurance at all. So I'm not sure that I see how it's destabilizing the industry, given that the existence of the FAIR Plan kind of allows the private market to opt out of selling in particular situations.
No, that's totally incorrect. That's absolutely incorrect. It doesn't allow it. It takes risks that they opted out, as you say, and it brings it in the back door. What are you talking about? The insurance companies cannot escape FAIR Plan liabilities. The insurance companies, they back up 100% the FAIR Plan. So how is it that somehow the FAIR Plan alleviates the concern that insurance companies have? The insurance companies are 100% responsible for every risk that the FAIR Plan writes, but the insurance companies don't get paid a dime for that business.
I see your point, definitely, but I think that the common perception among Californians right now is that there are private for-profit insurers that are turning down renewals or, say, not picking up new homeowners, not picking up entire planned unit communities. So there's a perception that the industry is picking and choosing in certain senses, and maybe hoping that the FAIR Plan can absorb it all. But where would people go if there weren't the perhaps imperfect instrument of the FAIR Plan?
I'm not arguing against the existence of the FAIR Plan. I'm saying that the FAIR Plan presents a catastrophic threat to the insurance industry, and if you think things are bad now, wait until the FAIR Plan bankrupts insurance companies by doing an assessment on them. Is that what we want? So when you talk about perception, I don't think that the public fails to understand the situation we're in. We had a long period of time where insurance companies were not permitted to raise their property insurance rates. Then we had historic levels of inflation and a reinsurance market that was out of control. And so it cannot be reasonably suggested that when we know exactly how much companies charge, how much they're making, there's price control and profit control. If the notion is that companies ought to just keep being freely open when they don't have enough money to pay the expected claims, that's not a serious contention, and I don't believe that's what the public is expecting. They're not expecting insurance companies to be driven into insolvency. What they're expecting is for a reasonable rate process that allows companies to charge certainly more than they do today, but substantially less than people are already paying in the FAIR Plan. We have a system now where we have a broken rate regulation system that doesn't permit adequate rates. And so what do? We punish consumers by saying, let's not fix that. Let's send people to the FAIR Plan where they're going to pay way more than if we just had a normal market rate that had been allowed to go up over time. People wouldn't be going to the FAIR Plan.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And I'm not intentionally trying to raise your blood pressure, Mr. Fraser. Your office wouldn't like me for that. But I'm wondering about SB 1060. Now, I think that PIF opposed that legislation by Senator Becker. And it's,
I think, well, I think we ultimately went neutral. He didn't, because of amendments that the Senate took, and then they in the Assembly. So I believe we were ultimately neutral. I believe he didn't like the amendments that were foisted on him as for leaving the Senate Appropriations Committee, and ultimately went over to the Assembly. He held it. So I'm not sure about your question. Now the what the author, and it was really what Dave Jones, who was active on that bill, was asking for, is he was asking that insurance companies be forced to include in their present considerations information that doesn't exist. So I hope you can understand why we would look at a bill like that and say, well, that doesn't make sense. How can companies comply with the bill when the science that they assert exists, when the databases that they assert exist don't? How are companies supposed to comply with that bill? The bill suffered from technical issues. We have no problem with the notion that companies should be using a wide variety of information when they're engaged in their underwriting, but the notion that there is a reliable, easily accessible database, for instance, that shows every fire break, where it's at, and its GIS coordinates, well, that database doesn't exist. Okay, and so that bill would have said we have to use that type of stuff, and we simply, not surprisingly, said, well, that might make sense, and companies would do it without being forced to when the database exists. And so we certainly have been supportive of what's called the BoE Data Commons Project, which is trying to figure out the common data elements that everyone believes should be included in a consideration like that, and figure out how to all the information flows go to one place so that companies can get access to it. We want to be part of that discussion, but certainly the bill former Commissioner Jones was seeking was just really punitive and ill thought out.
okay. And I'm just looking at the Assembly Committee on Insurance analysis from June 18th that was lists PIF in opposition. And I was just wondering, as part of that, does PIF have any problem with defining defensible space and pulling some terms from other parts of code so that we all have a common, transparent understanding of what defensible space or home hardening exactly means? And this is what I was trying to get at earlier, is that when it's always a moving target, then I think that people that we represent are sort of left wondering, am I there yet?
Yeah, I would say, imagine our frustration when the insurance industry funds the largest, really one of two of the largest mitigation research operations in the United States, the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, and tasked IBHS a few years ago with coming up with what are the elements of risk mitigation that are within the individual control of a homeowner that should be done. So IBHS, they come out with what they call the Wildfire Prepared Home Standard. Paradise was the first city that now requires all new home construction to adhere to the Wildfire Prepared Home Standards. And what does the Department of Insurance do? They say, we're going to ignore that science. So what IBHS's science says is that for ember resistance, embers are able to exploit any individual weakness. So they said the wildfire prepared home system is a system where you have to do every single thing. You have to put mesh on your attic vents. You have to have your exterior siding 6 inches above the ground. You have to have a 5-foot ember resistant zone. You have to do everything, because if you do everything but one, the ember will find that one weakness and burn your house down. So what does the Department of Insurance do? They say, well, insurance companies, we want you to come up with an a la carte method where you have to give a discount for each individual mitigation. And we say, well, that's not the science. And they say, yeah, but that's what we want to do, right? So then I hear complaints that for an individual mitigation, the discounts aren't big enough, but that's because the science says that it doesn't matter if you do one or two. of the wildfire prepared home things. You have to do all of them, right? So I get asked a lot of questions about the science. We feel like we actually put forward the science and suggested that policymakers use it, and instead what we got is an scientific approach. And now I get questions about why discounts aren't bigger.
Okay, so all of the members of PIF were united behind that one set of criteria?
Of the IBHS wildfire prepared home?
Yes,
Yeah, oh yeah.
okay. And another question, many of my constituents are just getting used to the idea of some of the technology that's being used, for example, drones. And so they have concerns about it. And does PIF or the industry in general have any problem with making drone images available to the consumers where it impacts their rates?
Where it impacts their rates or the underwriting decision.
Yeah.
I mean, generally on drones, I don't think we have a policy on it per se, because individual companies do it differently. Some are exploring the technology, others are not. It just depends on what you want. If you want companies to have the expense of sending people out and doing an inspection, that's obviously a lot more expensive than using a drone imagery. And so, you know, what is it that you want? If you want someone to climb up on a house and experience that risk, and obviously we're going to pay more to vendors to do that, that's going to have an increase in cost. So I don't know what it is you want. I mean, companies right now are able to go on someone's property and look at their roof. And so if they do it with effectively a camera, I don't see why the process should change. Right now, if there's an underwriting decision that's an adverse underwriting decision, companies have to explain it to the customer. And so I'm aware of many cases where there's been imagery used to say, no, we don't want you to, as a customer, and then the person says, well, show it to me, and then they work it out and they end up getting written. So I'm not sure. It feels like a false concern to me to say that somehow a drone picture is different than someone getting up on a roof and looking at the roof. But, you know, if it's something that concerns you, I want to hear it.
So thank you so much for that. And so PIF would not have a problem with saying.
Are we negotiating a bill here?
Perhaps. But would not have a problem with saying, you know, if images taken by a photographer on a ladder or a drone or whatever, however they're taken, they could be shared with someone if it impacts a decision on whether or not they're going to be covered.
Well, what I can say is if you have language you want us to look at and get a position, I'm happy to do it. But I don't want you to take something I say here out of context later when we see bill language that's incredibly hostile, and you say, but you said this was okay, right? I've been at this game a while, and I don't need that anymore.
No, I think you know that I'm very honorable about my bills. Thank you so much, and that's all the questions that I have for right now. But we really appreciate you being available to us,
You bet.
Mr. Fraser, because you're always around and you always have an eagle eye on what's going on. So appreciate that.
Thanks.
Deputy Controller Emron.
Thank you, Vice Chair Gaines, and Mr. Fraser, thank you. While I have you here, I do want to ask a question about undergrounding power lines, and just your thoughts on that. California's largest utility companies whose equipment has sparked some of the deadliest wildfires want to bury power lines in some of its most at-risk areas to prevent destructive blazes like Paradise, fire that killed 85 people. Burying a power line reduces the chance it will start a wildfire by 99% because it can't be blown down by windstorms. However, the plan is criticized for taking too long and a price tag of billions of dollars. Instead, advocates call for protective covers on these power lines, which reduce the chance of wildfire to 62%. So does the insurance industry support the burying of power lines by utility companies, which come with gradual rate increases, or is time of the essence and a quicker solution needed to reduce the risk of wildfire as soon as possible?
Yeah, I think when we were certainly fighting with the investor-owned utilities in 2017 and 2018, I think our initial reaction was, boy, wouldn't undergrounding be great? I think as we move forward and there's been the sticker shock associated with the cost of doing the undergrounding, it seems like that's been in less favor, particularly as, for PG&E. Looks like when they seek to cost recover for that, they get pressure at the PUC to not allow that. And so meanwhile, it seems like Edison has been more focused on insulated lines that at least prevent the spark from starting a fire before that circuit automatically shuts off. So, we don't have a position per se, but it certainly looks like the insulated lines is gaining more favor than the cost of undergrounding, particularly because PG&E's service territory, it's just so giant and mountainous for them to be able to underground is going to be difficult. Maybe it might make more sense if it's new construction. Maybe the cost wouldn't be so profound there. But that's certainly beyond my issue expertise.
Understood, and thank you for your response. And my very last question, there's been 4 counties so far this year: Shasta, San Bernardino, Placer, and now San Mateo counties have all passed resolutions this year asking for the state of California to declare a state of emergency over this insurance crisis. And just in your opinion, when you see counties, and that's a pretty spread out across the state, calling for action at the state of California, do you see this as a crisis that needs immediate response?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I've been saying that for years. I mean, someone recently described me as someone who's been saying the same thing for a long time, but people are finally starting to listen. And that's only because things have gotten as bad as they are. We've been advocating for a faster, more nimble rate consideration process for a long time. We've been asking for updating our rate approval formula for a long time. We continue on modeling and reinsurance. We're the only state in the country that holds on to its archaic ways. So we have to move forward. We have confidence in the vision that the commissioner has outlined in the sustainable insurance strategy. Now we just need to get the right words and the regulations, and we can move forward.
Thank you, Mr. Frazier, and good luck in that process. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Member Schaefer? No questions. Okay. Well, thank you. Oh, okay, yeah.
One came up as I was listening to this conversation, and I think you kind of touched on it, Mr. Frazier, when you mentioned that the FAIR Plan doesn't cover landslides. And I'm just wondering, do you have any novel cases that, I guess, outside of the wildfires, specifically for catastrophic events such as landslides? I'm just thinking of in my district in Los Angeles with the Palos Verdes situation happening. What options do they have, if any?
Yeah, I recently was on that road that is buckling. It's just shocking in RPV. There is one circumstance where I don't think it would apply to the area you're talking about, but where landslide is covered. So your fire insurance policy can cover landslide under a particular situation where, imagine it's a hillside. This happened in San Bernardino County several years ago. There's a hillside, there's a fire that rolls through, takes out all the grass. So now all the grass that was holding the dirt in place is gone or dead. Then rain comes shortly after that, and the rain turns that dirt into mud, but now there's no grass to hold it in place, and that mud starts to move. So California has a relatively novel approach that other states don't embrace, called the efficient proximate cause doctrine, that says the fire was the efficient proximate cause of the earth movement, and therefore your homeowner's policy has to cover when there's that earth movement, right? Now, what I understand about your situation, it's a high water table that's causing that land to move. So that wouldn't be implicated in the efficient proximate cause doctrine, but certainly there were, I want to say, $300 million in claims payments made in that Santa Barbara fire where the hillsides did start coming down. And that was covered by homeowners insurance companies because there had been a fire that preceded that rain-driven movement.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Rex. Really appreciate the time. I thought there were some great questions asked, and we just appreciate your expertise and your willingness to participate.
You bet. My pleasure. Bye-bye.
All right, take care. All right, how are we with our time? Mary?
Pretty much blown out of the water.
We're blown out of the water. Okay, we will move to our next speaker. Deborah Carlton, Executive Vice President, State Public Affairs, the California Apartment Association. How California's insurance market is affecting the availability of residential and business property in the state. There you are. Wonderful. Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair,
Wonderful.
Mr. Chair, and members. You already introduced me, so thank you very much. To add to that, we are the largest trade association for rental property owners and managers in the nation. We represent about 60,000 rental property owners and managers that together operate 2 million units throughout the state of California, and those are affordable and market rate housing. So in the interest of time, I've cut from my presentation everything that the previous speakers said, especially the affordable housing presentation. I can confirm that everything they said is absolutely accurate. Because in 2024 alone, our members saw an increase of 28%, and that's if they're lucky, in their premiums, and in the worst case, over 300%. And here's what our members have told us. Admitted carriers in California, as well as the reinsurance market, are dictating guidelines that we've never seen before. And those guidelines have resulted in increased premiums. Things such as, it's not just about fire, the use of crime scores. We're seeing that especially in our affordable housing owners. Property owners are being affected by situations they cannot control. Such as homeless camps around the building in the neighborhood, tagging of the buildings with graffiti in the community, and of course, theft and other crimes. Increases to the cost to rebuild. We heard that earlier. So that includes building costs and that includes labor costs. San Francisco, for example, $1,000 per square foot to build and or rebuild. Fire and reinsurance, they take into consideration claims throughout the nation. So it's not just the natural disasters here in California. Even if the owner has had no previous claims, they will see a premium increase. If the building is located in a brush fire zone, as you all know, their premiums will be higher. And as you already pointed out, legislative attempts this year were not successful when it came to reducing some of the premiums because of what the owner had done to reduce the risk, such as changes in the electrical system and or brush removal around the area. We wanted to ensure that that was taken into consideration, but unfortunately that was not successful. And of course, inflation and higher living costs here in California have translated to higher workers' comp and employee-related claims. And then in some areas like Los Angeles, the court system has a reputation for allowing what the carriers believe to be frivolous lawsuits, resulting in higher premiums. No matter how ethical or professional the owner is, or how careful they've been, there's still a high likelihood that during, for example, an eviction because of non-payment of rent or because of a nuisance, that there still would be a claim or at least an answer in the lawsuit against them, often non-related to the case itself, such as the owner harassed the tenant or there was discrimination, as a way in most cases to delay the eviction, forcing settlement. Usually the insurance companies will step in those cases and settle. And of course, that has driven up the costs in Los Angeles specifically. As insurance rates have risen, our members, especially those members with older buildings in rent-controlled communities where rents are capped, are not able to raise their rents to cover the cost of the insurance premium. And in those communities, owners are prohibited also from asking the tenant to carry renter's insurance to cover, for example, their own items that may be lost in a fire. Unfortunately, some of the most common interior fires we see are set by tenants with candles or things like that. So in those cases, they're not allowed to ask the tenant to carry their own insurance. So what do the owners do? Increase their deductibles. Some of them are as high as $100,000. We're seeing more owners try to self-insure, and I say try because you can't have a mortgage. And obviously, this is not a good solution because owners would and often face other claims, such as a tenant liability claim. And the high cost or lack of coverage means even if the owner wants to exit the market, and we heard that from the realtors this morning, they're challenged to find a buyer if they haven't been able to either obtain insurance or their insurance is too high. Rental housing owners are being forced to make extremely costly improvements. Not saying that's wrong, but they cannot recoup those costs to maintain their insurance, such as replacing electrical panels, installing a Class A fire roof, installing multi-pane windows, fire-resistant vents, et cetera. And again, in rent-controlled communities, the owner cannot recoup those costs. So as far as the FAIR Plan is concerned, if an owner is unable to find insurance, obviously the alternative option is to go to the FAIR Plan, which offers bare bones coverage. Here's some of our challenges. The plan will only cover, in some cases, up to, there's caps, $20 million for some of the larger buildings, $3 million for the single-family rental units. The plan may cover less also, depending upon the size and age of the building. And of course, it doesn't even come close to the value of many of these buildings in California. Obtaining insurance from the FAIR Plan is not a guarantee. If the owner's building insurance was canceled by their previous provider or the previous insurance company left the market, leaving the owner without insurance, the FAIR Plan may not even agree to cover the building, leaving the owner without insurance. The need for electrical upgrades, the age of the building, or past claims could cause the FAIR Plan to reject that owner. Insurance agents who represent our members have told us that they can go to the FAIR Plan for coverage. They could wait as long as 4 hours on the phone to get somebody to pick up. Hopefully you don't lose the line at that time. And not to disparage the FAIR Plan, but what this implies, there's just a limited amount of resources there. Then the quote for the building coverage can take up to 5 months for the FAIR Plan to review and provide a premium quote, always with strict underwriting requirements. All the while, the owner may be without coverage. If the owner has a mortgage, the mortgage company will always require added coverage in addition to the FAIR Plan, such as business income, loss of rents, liability, coverage for other property losses such as fire that may not be covered under the FAIR Plan. Insurance agents also report that our owners and what we're seeing through the California Department of Insurance is incredibly slow at moving the insurance rate flexibility, as we heard from Mr. Frazier. He's absolutely right on that. That drives our property owners to the surplus excess marketplace for coverage with substantially higher premiums and with less coverage. Typically, these rates are 35 to 50% higher with limited coverage for exposures. So in conclusion, the insurance costs coupled with rent control or the threat of rent control are the biggest challenges this industry has seen in decades. As an organization that promotes rental housing, affordable housing, we are seeing fewer owners entering the market. And of course, to construct nowadays in California, from the beginning to breaking ground could be as long as 8 years. Owners are leaving the market, converting their smaller buildings to either owner-occupied or tenancy in common or condominiums if allowed. With the housing crisis we face in California, we need to find a solution. So I thank you very much for holding this hearing today and for inviting us to present.
Thank you, Deborah, very much. Members that have questions? Member Vasquez?
Yes. Thank you, Ms. Carlton, for your presentation and the information. I was just wondering, I guess it was CAA has been supportive in efforts to reform some of the insurance market in a balanced, sustainable way. Does this include the support of AB, I think it was 2996 Alvarez, the Assembly bill?
Yes, all the bills, SB 1060, AB 1933, and the Alvarez bill, we have been really pushing for reform within the industry. A balanced approach, too, because of course, as Mr. Frazier pointed out, we don't want insurance companies leaving the market, so we really do need a balanced approach. If our owners have to go to other outside non-admitted carriers, it's so much more expensive. So certainly a balanced approach is very important to us.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Other comments? Chair Lieber.
Just a brief comment. Thank you so much for coming today to raise the issues that are very specific to what is the predominant type of housing in California. And so I appreciate all the points that you've made and also the support for balanced legislation that will let people know what the factors are in a decision. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Deputy Controller Emron.
Thank you, Vice Chair, and thank you, Ms. Carlton, for coming and being patient with us today. When a major wildfire strikes and destroys home and critical infrastructures, if that infrastructure is not quickly rebuilt, homeowners may be forced to leave their community. In rural communities, even a few people leaving can erode a tax base. And eroded tax base undermines public services like emergency response and schools, which can decimate a town. If citizens in rural areas who want to rebuild struggle to get insurance coverage and housing in general, what does the fate of rural communities look like in California?
You know, Paradise being the perfect example. I know we worked on legislation like that to make sure there were more and better roads in and out of the area. That's a tough question. You know, I think we're seeing the premiums in those areas, people insisting on rebuilding in areas that we fear, future fires as well. So, I don't know the answer to that because it's certainly about the homeowners who wish to live in the rural areas. We've got to find a way to balance out the premiums for them and the premiums for the rest of the state that live in the more urban areas.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Member Schaefer, any comments or questions? You okay? All right. Very good. Well, Deborah Carlton, thank you so much for your presentation. We appreciate it.
Thank you for
Thanks
having
for
me.
being patient. All right. Mr. Norwood, he's been here all day.
Well, I was
John
gonna
Norwood.
interrupt, because we are almost at the time for a break, but I guess we can begin.
How much time?
It's okay, we can, as long as we anticipate after this.
Okay, very good. So John Norwood, Principal Norwood Associates, looking for an insurance industry perspective on current California insurance market and ideas for expanding the supply of insurance.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. My name is John Norwood. I'm appearing today on behalf of the Independent Insurance Agents and Brokers of California. Thank you for the opportunity. IIAB Cal is a nonprofit trade association, represents 350 agencies and brokerages that employ thousands of agents in California that sell property and casualty insurance. Our members sell all types of insurance, but predominantly in the property casualty space. In fact, I think they produce about 80% of the commercial insurance business in California and about 25% of the personal lines insurance. Our members have been severely harmed by the continuing crisis of insurance availability. Our members live and work in the communities that they serve. Many of them have longstanding relationships with their clients. I mean, their families knew each other. They went to high school together. They belonged to the same clubs or churches or this and that. So for our members, this is personal. Our members indicate that this is the worst market any of them have seen in their careers. Even our bigger companies that are international brokers don't have any markets for homeowners insurance. I mean, they're limited to maybe, 5 applications a month or something like that, and they're putting hundreds of policies into the FAIR plans a month. And, for every client that they have to send someplace else for insurance or go to the non-admitted market or this and that, they, despite the relationships, they may never get them back. And, I mean, these are people, when you insure a winery or a ranch or something like that, you're talking about multiple types of coverages. These are big premiums, and they pay commissions, and they keep the agency in business, and they're part of the fabric of that community. So it is a big deal for our members. It's interesting that the media, legislators, public policy makers really only started focusing on this crisis in May of last year when State Farm announced that they were going to make a pause. The smaller market share insurance companies, which our members rely on, started exiting the market 2 years before that announcement. So, for our members, they've been into this 4 years now and going. This needs to be resolved. This crisis needs to be resolved yesterday as far as they're concerned for them and their clients. There are about 110 insurance companies that write property insurance in California. It's down from 163. The top 10 or 12, we all know, they advertise at the football games and the golf tournaments and this and that. And our members do place with some of those, Nationwide, Liberty Mutual, Mercury, that type of thing. But it's the other 90 that balance the marketplace. One of the things we talked about was geographic diversity. I mean, you can write hurricanes and tornadoes and things back east where there's $30 to $50 billion worth of damage. If you have enough diversity and risk, and adequate rates and speed of rate review, you can do that. I mean, so it's those other companies, as long as you have diversity, but it's those other companies that we rely on. And, they were great until 2017, 2018, 2019, all of a sudden we started having these big fires. And then the cost of reinsurance just ballooned. We talked about reinsurance a little bit here. I saw a study not too long ago that that the worldwide reinsurance market in the last 5 years has suffered losses in excess of $100 billion. The prior 5 years, it was $50 billion. So that just gives you one indication of why reinsurance went up. But these smaller companies, smaller market share companies, just simply couldn't afford the increased cost of rates in the current regulatory framework where they didn't think they would get any relief. As I think Rex Frazier talked about under Proposition 103, insurance rates must be based on prior losses, and the statute does not allow credit for increased cost of reinsurance. The system may have worked well during a time when, the risk was predictable in California, but we're beyond that time. I think it's something that people really don't understand is that prior to 2017, fire wasn't even a real risk in California. So we were a state that was a non-catastrophic state. The only really big things that would befall property in California were earthquake or floods, and neither one of them was covered under the homeowners policy. But, and I think the largest fire prior to that was the Oakland Hills fire, which was $1 billion fire way back when. Well, then you start having, regularly $10 billion fires. And so California has joined Florida, Texas, Louisiana, and Oklahoma as one of the big catastrophic states. The only thing is our rates are about 40% below those states. So, that's one of the big issues that companies are dealing with right now. Insurance companies have to have reinsurance in order to operate. Reinsurers use catastrophic modeling and climate change to develop their rates, but companies in California are kind of in that catch-22. They know it's happening to them, but they can't pass those costs along. So, we know companies want to sell insurance in the state, and what they need to do it is adequate rates, timely rate decisions, and geographic diversity. And unfortunately, as Mr. Frazier pointed out, they haven't got any of that, for years. And that predates the current administration. I think we talked a little bit about the FAIR Plan. The FAIR Plan presents a really perfect example of the problem. As indicated, prior to the last few years, the FAIR Plan only had a small percentage of coverage. Now, I think the last testimony I heard from the FAIR Plan, they're pushing $400 billion in liability. their cash basis to pay those claims cash basis in reinsurance is about $3 billion. Everything beyond that would go back on the industry. The FAIR Plan decided, it testified that they needed a rate increase between 72 and 48%. They decided to ask for 48%, going with a lower number, and to reflect the changed circumstances. It took 25 months, and they got a 15% rate increase, because frankly, the current system doesn't allow them to support the rate increase based on what the risk is. And it's a risk that everybody knows. I mean, you know, every study you look at says, you know, climate change is affecting California and the wildfire risk is getting more than less. I think the Department of Insurance first big study on the climate said 77% more of California will be in a high fire risk danger. So, you know, that's a factor. I just read an article yesterday that because of the ecological systems we have in California, that wildfires grow, I think, at a rate of 400% faster than they did a decade ago. Now, it may be 250% in other states, but California is 400%. Why? It's not just the forests, it's an overgrown urban interface, but also a grassland ecosystem that is in the foothills, is in the coastal areas throughout the Central Valley. So, you know, what is not subject to high fire risk in California? And that's something that we're going to have to deal with going forward. And I think you know, we have hope that what the commissioner is working on right now is going to make a difference. Again, for our members, it couldn't happen any faster, and I'm sure that's, as everybody's expressed here. I think you have to keep in mind that you know, insurance rates just don't go up willy-nilly. I mean, when this sustainable insurance package is done, it's still going to be done under an elected commissioner that has the prior approval authority over your rates. There's 1,500 people in the Department of Insurance that are committed to making sure those rates are justified. And as Mr. Frazier pointed out, you have to go through procedures, you know, to get those rates approved. I mean, even if you want to discount for something, or you want to give a 5% discount for people who wear glasses, you've got to go to the department and show why people who wear glasses are 5% less at risk than people who don't wear glasses. So you just can't do what you want to do. So, you know, we're hoping that these reforms make a difference. We know that California is literally the center of the storm in terms of climate change. The state faces a significant resiliency challenge. I was at a program the other day with a renowned writer who basically said California, he wrote a recent book on why California burns. He says, you know, we're going to have to get back to that point where we do prescribe burn, we do forest thinning, we do those kinds of things. He suggested 10 million acres a year. I mean, you know, the Department of Forestry or CAL FIRE did 67,000 acres last year. Now I just read we're in combination with the federal government, tribes, and CAL FIRE, they did 1.2 million acres, and that's fabulous. I mean, but it's something we have to get back here, and we have to understand that California is basically a tinderbox, and it's going to take billions of dollars a year found in the budget to address these. The Department of Natural Resources now has a dashboard that they're doing that sets forth all the efforts they're doing throughout the state. You know, hopefully more and more of that goes on. And I think, as Mr. Frazier pointed out, we also need databases that we can rely on in terms of the science of what we need to do for home hardening, for fire-resistant communities and that type of thing, that has to be public so the insurers can put that into their systems when they ask for rates. Happy to answer any questions you might have. There's a lot, so much was covered today. My mind was just kind of spinning.
Yeah, there's been a lot covered today. Thank you very much, John. I just have a question on one thing I've learned is that this reinsurance issue, they've become kind of the power players, right? Because if you're an insurance company, you can't get your reinsurance, you've got a big problem. Or if you can get it, I've been told that they've also been kind of dictating some of the underwriting practices of the insurance companies, of what we will and will not accept. Can you
there's
shed
no
any
doubt.
light on, and a lot of these players are, like in Europe or around, the reinsurers are worldwide.
Yeah, worldwide, yeah, and read a couple of months ago that one of the key reinsurers said, we're done continuing to write time after time communities or places that are going to flood or burn or whatever the case may be. We're not going to do it anymore. We're basically contributing to our own ills. And you compare private reinsurance market to like the National Flood Program. I mean, the National Flood Program is billions of dollars. I want to say underwater, but it's too much of a pun, because, all the people in Florida and North Carolina and South Carolina, every time one of these hurricanes come along, wipe out these homes, they get built again. It's not like those hurricanes aren't going to come back. So, that's just a case study of inadequate rates and what happens. And I guess if you're the government and can print money, you can survive that. But the reinsurance industry is taking another look at things. I think it was mentioned that these things come and go, right? The market softened up a little bit. Yes. There's also a catastrophic bond market. And like in the recent 2 hurricanes back east, the reinsurance or the companies are talking about $30 to $50 billion worth of losses. The catastrophic bond market,
which is an alternative to the reinsurance market,
yes,
right?
Yes, they had 0 losses. So it's a competitor, and it helps keep the prices down. And I think, when prices start getting too high, there's somebody else comes in with an opportunity to make money, and that's the catastrophic bond market is something that's starting to balance that system a little bit.
Wonderful. Thank you. Member Vasquez, questions?
Thank you for your perspective. And I think some of the issues you raised are really important as we're moving forward with some of these specific issues, especially with this whole crisis with the insurance. And I was just wondering, from your take, have you seen any proposed legislation out there that would address some of the marketplace issues you described?
Well, to be frank, I think our goal, at least the last couple of years, has been, let's get this sustainable insurance package done. Let's don't try to make it more complicated for insurers at this point. And again, this kind of goes to those 90 smaller market share companies. Now, some of them may be big companies like Travelers, but they only have a smaller market share in personal lines. Some of them are small companies like Merced Mutual was. To the extent that you make it more costly for them, they have to jump through more hoops, et cetera, they just go someplace else. That'll be the easiest thing for them. I'm sure you talked about the FAIR Plan, and this, I don't think it was absolutely clear. The big problem with the FAIR Plan right now, it's a huge disincentive for these companies to come back. Every new policy they write increases their percentage of writings in California, which increases the potential for an assessment. If you look at the FAIR Plan testimony, they have pockets in California that are in, Sonoma, Napa, Carmel, Lake Tahoe, Big Bear, Lake Arrowhead, this and that. Those pockets are $7-8 billion of insurance apiece. When we had this fire a couple of weeks ago down Southern California, it was pushing into Big Bear. They've even testified if it goes to Big Bear, it's going to go to Lake Arrowhead. I mean, that's $15 billion worth, with a potential liability for the FAIR Plan. That FAIR Plan has got to get depopulated in order for the companies to come back in. And rates are frankly going to have to go up in the FAIR Plan, because otherwise agents aren't going to be able to move business out of the FAIR Plan. You're going to call, Consumer X and say, hey, great deal, we can move you out. It's a 30% increase, from their last deal. And it's like, well, I can't afford that, so I'm going to stay in the FAIR Plan. I don't care if it's, worse coverage. But that's the kind of thing that's going to happen to depopulate the plan.
It's a balancing act, because I think what will happen if things work out the way they should, if these reforms go through in the regs that the insurance commissioner is working on, that should stabilize the market, and rates, I think, eventually could go down. They'll at least stabilize. And at that point, you would probably raise the rates at the FAIR Plan to force people back into the normal market, which should be stabilized and should be less expensive.
Right.
But it's not there yet.
Yeah, it doesn't say anything, but California's homeowner rates are 28th in the nation. So it doesn't make it any easier when you're on a fixed budget and, you can't afford your insurance. But, our rates are going to have to reflect the reality of climate change. Climate change is affecting everything else that, consumers pay for: the cost of energy, the cost of gasoline, the cost of food, the, cost of building, this and that. Insurance isn't any different. We just got there late.
Great, wonderful. Okay, so, yes, Chair Lieber.
You're making me think of 2006 when I had the first bill on sea level rise. And people told me that they had never heard of that and therefore it didn't exist. And we know that in California in the future, there's going to be even more flooding from sea level rise, but also from bay level rise, and really ominously from groundwater rise in areas like the entire Bay Area. And I'm just wondering, like, if you had a succinct policy prescription for us of three things that might help. I mean, in a perfect world, rates would make enough sense to consumers that they would leave the FAIR plan and depopulate that as the intention was from the beginning. But that's not currently happening. And for folks that I see, they're at the outer edge of what they can afford, given everything, mortgages, childcare of $4,500 a kid per month, the incredible cost of having an automobile in California, et cetera, et cetera. So what do you think, and I know that you're a veteran of a lot of battles in the Capitol, but what do you think of, what would be three things that you think would help?
Wow. California can always look at a state reinsurance pool of some sort that would help on some of these issues. I mean, we've had big issues in the past with regard to daycare crisis and malpractice coverage and those kinds of things. We're about to have another huge one in the foster care area. So, maybe that's something that could be looked at to provide some assistance somewhere. I think, we have subsidies or dollars available for rent assistance, for utility assistance, this and that. At some point, we have to recognize we have people that just can't afford it, that are on assistance and fixed incomes and things like that. And they're either going to be on the street or we're going to help them someplace. And we don't need them on the street because we can't deal with that issue. It was talked about years ago when it was pretty clear that earthquake insurance was not really an affordable, something that the insurance industry could write, especially, you're just writing it in California, again, geographic diversity. And there's this idea that, well, we have hurricanes, we have tornadoes, and we have earthquakes and this and that. Why don't we have a federal backstop of some sort? To maybe, weigh in and provide some help that is different from, the private worldwide market. Maybe that's an idea. I mean, those are kind of I don't know if they're out of the box thinking or not, but those are some ideas I might have.
Okay, thank you, and thanks for hanging in here with us.
Oh, sure. It was very entertaining.
Wonderful. All right, Deputy Controller Emron.
Thank you, Vice Chair. I want to thank you, Mr. Norwood. Great influx of energy in this afternoon session we have here. You mentioned a little bit in your remarks about the prescribed burning, the forest thinning, raking the forest. There's many names nowadays. The state of California has appropriated $3.7 billion to forest treatment, and even the Biden-Harris administration has provided $5 billion. Some of that's going to go to California for wildfire mitigation on federal lands. And even there's HOAs and local governments levying taxes and fees to undertake forest treatment. Do insurance companies account for forest management in their models when setting premiums? If not, why not?
Yeah, I remember that $3.7 billion number was bandied about a little bit with the same bill, and it turns out that it may be budgeted, it hasn't been spent, or at least half of it hasn't been spent. There's a lot of things that have been going right. As I said, I told Mr. Gaines I went to a program that the Natural Resources had a month or so ago, where they brought in federal government, tribes, CAL FIRE, everybody to talk about this new dashboard and what the efforts everybody was doing in terms of forest thinning. This is really impressive stuff, and it's going to need money. I think insurance companies want to and will take into effect those kinds of things. Part of it is trying to get the database that's out there, so people know. I mean, there's no way for insurance company X to know that, Sonoma County did this, to protect these homes. And it is all about community. It's community resilience, not necessarily individual resilience. So I think it's something that the industry, is open to, but you've got to have the data to be able to feed these companies, especially the small companies that just don't have the ability to go get that. I mean, traditionally, what happened was the Insurance Services Office, collected everybody's losses, and then they put out, kind of recommended pure premium rates, because companies don't have enough losses of their own to be able to predict those. And then, companies would use those to go forward. There's some antitrust issues that were around that were raised by Prop 103 at one point, but I think they've been resolved.
Yeah, understood. It's very, very understandable as we look at the wildfire mitigation. I mean, the state's putting so much money into it. I think it should be taken into account to some extent. I don't know exactly which when determining premiums, because I understand that home hardening, when a homeowner takes certain steps, hardening the windows, putting a sprinkler system out there, vegetation, that is included in the modeling when setting premiums, but not necessarily forest management at this point. So that's maybe something we can look into in the future. And then just really quickly on the FAIR plan, as more people are going to be jumping onto the California FAIR plan, I think it's about a third of new policies now in California. California is looking for ways to shore up its FAIR plan in case there is a major disaster, in case the idea that, God forbid, that it does go insolvent. And one of the ideas that the controller and I have heard is giving FAIR plans the ability to sell catastrophic bonds or other bonds to raise capital.
Sure.
Or is there any suggestion that you have in order to make sure that we can shore up the FAIR
Yeah,
plan?
that's one of the ideas, and I think that it's a good one. Like I think Mr. Frazier said, once they get through the cash they have, if there's an assessment on the industry, the commissioner has a plan to deal with that. And I think that, and also the Alvarez bill was going to deal with that. Unfortunately, that was a victim of politics. Hopefully that will get resolved sometime in the future, but it's a major concern of a lot of companies. That to get that resolved will really help, I think, bring back the smaller players. And I also at the beginning of your program, you talked about Paradise and Merced Mutual and the California Insurance Guarantee Association, and pretty sure that nobody in Paradise had a problem with their insurance coverage when the guarantee fund took over. They handled those claims. They went out of their way to make sure that whatever limits they had on the FAIR plan applied to each coverage under the homeowner's policy, thereby multiplying the amount of coverage that was available. I think they took care of everybody up there.
And I guess my last question, and I just want to get this on the record. We talk about wildland-urban interface, building in zones that are at risk of high danger. And this idea where, there's a major disaster that comes, these businesses, these communities, these homes, they burn down, but people have been living there their whole lives. They want to rebuild.
Right.
So how can we as a state and insurance companies kind of find that middle ground between proactive planning, land use planning, and also just making sure that people are not in harm's way?
It's a tough one. When I was younger, I wanted cars that went really fast. And so, they had turbochargers on them, things like that. So I had to pay a lot more for insurance than people with a four-cylinder car. And it's really kind of the same thing. I mean, yeah, I can see why you want to live in Lake Tahoe or you want to live in the foothills. And it's just, it is going to cost more. And all we can really do is try to do everything we can on the fire resiliency issue. The budget issue on fire resiliency is going to be huge. I mean, when California had a $100 billion budget, the amount budgeted for fire resiliency was pretty close to the amount that was budgeted to clean up trash along the highways. It was about 1.5 or $2 billion. It wasn't $12 billion for homeless and $10 billion for homeless or for affordable housing, $6 billion for internet. I mean, you've got to prioritize these things. And I think an awfully strong case can be made for wildfire being, if not California's number one problem, awfully close to it. I mean, if you read kind of these articles, you have just the fire destruction, loss of life with wildfires. Then you have on top of that the health effects of people with asthma and this and that. We're also recently read about farm workers who are in the fields and adversely affected by wildfire smoke, that kids in schools, because often they don't have air conditioners and things like that, that you just go down the line. There are so many things affected by, the destruction, the smoke, the this and that it makes an awfully good case. But we got to prioritize this at a higher level.
Absolutely, I agree, and thank you for your testimony today.
Sure.
All right, Member Schaefer.
Yes, thank you, Member Gaines. Do you ever consider the level of enforcement of arson? I think that's more of a factor in a lot of our losses than we want to recognize. And also, we are like the seventh biggest, I think, nation in the world. If we were a nation, how do the other six civilized nations deal with all these problems? Do you have an opportunity once a year to have a conclave where some of our brightest minds from both the insured and the insurers maybe talk about these things and find out what's going on? Is there anything going on planet Earth that we don't know about?
There is a reinsurance reunion every year where all the big reinsurers get together. Haven't gone to it yet because I couldn't afford Monaco. But that is a place where things are discussed. But I think there is a lot of discussion in the industry through trade publications and studies, everything else that have really brought climate change to the focus. Obviously, former Commissioner Jones thinks that insurance companies shouldn't be insuring fossil fuel companies because they're contributing to the potential losses. That's a point of view. I think companies are starting to weigh what they're doing. As I mentioned, the CEO of a major reinsurer said, we're gonna clamp down on what we're insuring. We're not gonna go where there's multiple events all the time. Hopefully this whole process will bring improvements in the system, and as we put more money into fire resiliency and home hardening and this and that, and get the regulatory system under control, that things will flatten out a little bit. But unfortunately, if you look at California's 28 in homeowners insurance costs, that we're 40% below the other 5 catastrophic states in terms of property insurance. Sad reality is that insurance here is going to be 30 or 40% higher. And you talk to a lot of people and they go, yeah, I'll do that because I can somehow budget for it. Whether you're a business, I can somehow find a way to budget for it, but I can't budget for the 500%. I can't budget for the fact, well, the incumbent industry, the admitted industry has gone away, and then it leaves it to the non-admitted industry or the fair plan or the non-admitted industry. There's only so much capacity in the world. The non-admitted industry was made to cover unique risks, not necessarily homeowners insurance. They always covered like the high-end homeowners risks that were in Monterey and Laguna Beach and Santa Monica, whatever the case may be, but that's not their role, and they don't have the capacity to do that. That's why when they do write it, it becomes expensive.
And you know that CalPERS is one of the biggest investment funds there is anywhere. They own $1 billion worth of stock and this and that. Maybe some of it is in insurance companies. If they have a big stake in an insurance company is thinking of leaving California, maybe CalPERS can look at the rationality of what's going on and negotiate them staying. They have enough clout as a $500 million investor in some companies. I don't know if anyone's ever looked at that, but I would look at their portfolio and see if there's any insurance companies that we're having issues with, and that would be a factor if politics are entering into it.
Well, it comes down to, for companies getting adequate rates and not waiting a year or 2 years for a rate review. I mean, that's been pretty common for a long time. You can't wait that long.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John Norwood, really appreciate it. We're going to take a break. What time would we, okay, so 10-minute recess, so 3:30. Great, and then we'll have, the consumer advocate is up next. recent and proposed changes to the insurance regulation in our state. Welcome, Carmen.
Thank you for having me. Thanks for sticking around for the late afternoon presentation.
Yeah, and thank you for participating. We appreciate it.
Well, thank you everyone for the invitation and for asking to hear the consumer point of view on the very real insurance crisis that every type of insurance purchaser in the state is facing right now. I do have a presentation, but I just wanted to flag, since I think it's been talked about in a few different ways today, something up front, which is that one of the reasons consumers are having such a hard time getting and affording insurance right now is because of insurance companies' irresponsible use of opaque, unaccountable technologies. And it's not just people in fire areas, the fire score that we've been talking about, but everywhere. The example that was given was insurers using drone imagery for insurance rating or sales decisions. Insurers are actually going beyond their own drones to pay outside companies for aerial imagery that includes satellite imagery and other pictures to make blanket decisions about who gets coverage and who pays more. And these technologies can decide a shadow on your roof is mold and decide not to cover you, or that your house is too cluttered because they happen to fly by during the neighborhood garage sale day. And there's very little that insurance companies disclose to consumers about these decisions unless they really push. And there's certainly no requirement for a process for consumer response and correction when these decisions are made in error. And then this moves on to fire areas where we talk about these wildfire scores. PIF talked about a fire line being one of them, where insurance companies are using, and this is where the transparency comes in, secret algorithms in order to, again, determine who pays more, whether my home is more at higher fire risk, and who doesn't get insurance at all. And these wildfire scores are opaque because they're owned by Wall Street or Silicon Valley firms who refuse to disclose their data sources, the assumptions that they make, and how they're weighing the factors that go into whether you pay more or you're faced with a non-renewal. And then that's added onto this mitigation question. And for an industry that's supposed to be in the business of reducing risk, the insurance industry has been extraordinarily reticent to recognize all of the different investments that have been talked about today, the individual and community and statewide and federal level investments in wildfire protection, whether it's fire breaks or an individual replacing the vents at their home. And recently, most recently, county fire officials have credited some of those actions, some prescribed burns, forest management, and individual homeowners' defensible space for saving structures in the bridge fire, the park fire, and the line fire, the biggest fires we experienced in California recently. And so when these things are not accounted for in rates, and when they're not transparent, we're all paying more unnecessarily. So let me just pull up my presentation. Oops. And of course, after all of this, it's giving me a little trouble. Hopefully this works. All right. I think you all can see that, but let me know if you can't. One thing that I think we really should just kind of set the level on a little bit is the reality of the insurance market here in California. There is no question that 6 years ago, California insurers experienced two big loss years because of the serious fires in 2017 and 18. But this chart shows national loss ratios in California versus nationally, and it shows that those big spikes were nowhere near as high except for those two big fire years. So losses were nowhere near as bad except for 2017 and 18. And what is much less talked about is that the insurance industry was repaid billions from the utilities from those huge losses. So PG&E alone repaid the insurance companies $11 billion for losses in the camp and other fires that year. The fact of the matter is that the insurance industry, the home insurance industry in California specifically, is doing better than insurance companies nationwide. If you look at the past 20 years of data provided by the insurance industry to the National Association of Insurance Commissioners, insurance companies do better on every measure in California than the national average. And this is 4 different ways that insurance companies measure how they're doing. We focus on the last one, direct return on net worth, because it's not only the premiums that companies collect, the claims they pay out, but critically it takes into account the investment income that insurance companies are earning, and that is a key piece of profitability for the insurance industry. It always has been and it always will be. And you see on that bottom line, California is 3 percentage points better than the national average in the home insurance line. And that, I won't belabor it, but I know you will eventually have access to these slides. This next slide just shows that that plays out in the most recent years that we have data for. That California, which is the blue line, is doing better on every measure than insurance companies are doing nationally. And that's really critical because it goes to the narrative that the insurance industry is peddling here in California, that they're going bankrupt because of California's regulatory system. And that's simply not true. Insurance companies are not going broke in California. Now, that is not to say that there are not real cost pressures, and we've talked about them all day. Inflation, construction costs, labor costs, the real increase in climate-related disasters, supply chain problems, inflation, and actually even Wall Street losses after the pandemic. All of those things are true, but they're not unique to what is happening in states across the country. And some of the national reporting is really focused on the fact that climate-driven catastrophes are not a coastal problem. They are facing the insurance industry nationwide. But again, as these numbers show, California is doing better than the rest of the country. So to the extent companies are facing these legitimate cost increases, California's regulatory system has allowed them to increase rates to reflect that. And that is shown, we've talked about some of these, so I won't belabor it, but it is shown in the double-digit rate increases that every one of the top 10 home insurance companies in California has received over the past couple of years, several of them multiple rate increases. State Farm got 2 for about 27%. Farmers got 4 for about 44%. Allstate got 2 for 37% increases. And of course, as you've all discussed, those are averages. So the insurance industry is getting significant rate increases under California's current system. Yet they're still restricting sales. So what more is going on here that's not happening in other states? And that is that the insurance industry isn't letting this real economic pressure go to waste. They are taking the current situation and using it to push the deregulation that they have wanted for decades. And that is the industry's biggest target in California, our system of rate regulation, which is California's Prop 103. And full disclosure, although my guess is many of you already know this, Prop 103 was written by Consumer Watchdog's founder. It was passed as a ballot initiative in 1988 by the voters. And it did some very simple things. It said insurance companies, rather than just charging whatever they want, have to come into the state insurance commissioner, open their books, justify the rates they want to charge, and get approval from the commissioner before raising rates. It required full transparency of everything that goes into a rate increase, which is critical for making sure those rates are fair. And it created a system of public participation that's funded so consumer representatives are on equal footing with the insurance industry. And those savings, or those reforms, according to the Consumer Federation of America, have saved Californians billions over the last 35 plus years that it's been in effect. Specifically, and this is the public participation process that the insurance industry dislikes so much, Consumer Watchdog has used that public participation process over the last 2+ decades to save homeowners and drivers over $6 billion in what would have otherwise been excessive insurance rate increases. And that is really the picture of why the insurance industry doesn't like this process. And because it did get some attention, I wanted to focus on just a few of the pieces of misinformation that are out there. One of the most important, or one of the biggest beefs of the insurance industry is that consumers do get that funding, so they're on equal footing with the army of actuaries and lawyers that the insurance industry can bring to the table. And I want to just point out, in this context, for the $6 billion that Consumer Watchdog has saved using that process over the last 22 years, our experts, actuaries, lawyers, economists, the people who can crunch the numbers to actually review a rate increase, have cost $13.5 million in fees that have been paid to Consumer Watchdog. And if you pencil that out over those 22 years, that equals a quarter in cost for every $100 saved to policyholders. So by any measure, that is a huge return on investment for consumers in what would have otherwise been excessive insurance rates. One of the other things the industry likes to do is blame public participation for some of those delays in the rate review process. And we do not argue that rates are being approved at a rate that's sometimes slower than it should be. That is due in large part to the insurance industry dragging its feet in providing the information that not just public interveners, because we only intervene in a handful of rate proceedings every year, but the Department of Insurance is seeking from insurance companies. And that's also because the department is really understaffed, and I think they're making a laudable good faith effort to try and close some of those staffing problems. But the industry likes to say that it is just the interveners who are slowing things down. So this slide just takes a snapshot of most recent years, 2022 and 2023, and compares rate approvals that Consumer Watchdog was involved in and the vast majority that the department did on their own. And you can see that the timelines are basically the same in home and auto, whether the department was acting on their own or whether our public participation was included, the average rate approval time was the same. So the public participation process is not what's slowing things down. And similarly, you heard today that we don't add anything to the process, that we're just copying what the department does, and that's also false. We did the same thing where we looked at proceedings that we were involved in and that the department did on their own. And when you're looking at auto and home insurance rate approvals, the department approves about 97% of what companies are asking for. When there's public participation, that percentage goes down to 60 to 70%. So there are clear savings for the public from public participation in rate oversight. And, you know, that's why it's in the industry's crosshairs. Unfortunately, the insurance industry's solution to the problem they have really created by pausing sales or pulling out of markets is the same as what the insurance commissioner has proposed. And we've talked a lot today about the elements of the commissioner's plan, so I don't have to go into them in detail, but the commissioner's plan is the insurance industry's wish list. He's going to limit rate review, allow insurance companies to use these models, secret, unaccountable algorithms in order to raise premiums. He will allow the pass-through of the global unregulated insurance costs from reinsurance and put consumers on the hook for bailing out insurance companies for fair plan losses. So those are the elements of the sustainable insurance strategy. Unfortunately, they will not solve the problem, even though they will raise rates. And we know this because they haven't worked elsewhere. The insurance industry likes to harp on the fact that, other states are doing this, why don't we? But Florida is the perfect example of why not. They have tried every one of these solutions, and they are way worse off than we are today. 4 times as many policyholders are in their version of the FAIR Plan. Their rates are 2.5 times as high, and insurance companies still are not selling there. So even putting together everything the insurance industry wants doesn't bring them back into the market. But unfortunately, that is what the sustainable insurance strategy from the commissioner is relying on. Now, there is a silver lining. The commissioner has said that in return for these steps that the insurance industry wants, and in hopes of coaxing them back into the market if they get them, the Department of Insurance has said they're going to require in return insurance companies to move back into the areas where they've abandoned homeowners. And that would be great, at least a silver lining to this plan if it worked. Unfortunately, We have the text of this regulation now. We have the text of the rule that says insurance companies are going to make this commitment. And the fine print of the regulation doesn't match the public promises. The big one is this commitment that insurers will sell 85% in distressed areas of what they sell in the rest of the market. But the regulation doesn't require that. In fact, it says companies can choose to make a commitment to increase sales to 85% of what they sell in the rest of the market. They could also choose instead to only increase sales by 5% in those areas. And you could see easily how an insurance company who's already abandoned riskier parts of the state could increase sales by 5%, which would reflect a very, very small increase in access for consumers overall. And then on top of those two things, if an insurance company didn't like either of them, there's an alternative commitment also written into the regulation that an insurance company can make up a proposal and go to the department with that instead. So there is no required 85% commitment in the regulation. Then after that, insurance companies have 2 years to show they've met their commitment. So we're out to 2027 by now. But the regulation has another loophole. It says that insurance companies can come to the department and say, well, unfortunately, we didn't meet our goal, but we made a reasonable effort to meet our goal. And the insurance commissioner can simply move the goalposts. So now we are 2 years out. An insurance company made a commitment that they didn't meet. They're changing the rules for what they might have to meet in the future, and consumers still don't have access to coverage. And I should have put this first, but the regulation also doesn't require policies to be comprehensive. So an insurance company could be selling the equivalent of what consumers get on the FAIR plan to meet their commitment. And if all of these things happen, consumers will be no better off than they are today. We certainly aren't going to be increasing consumers' access to coverage at this time next year, but we will be facing, because of these increased costs that insurers will pass on to consumers, huge rate increases. And that is not going to get Californians covered again. It's not going to get Californians out of the FAIR plan. So we need to do something different, which brings us to our solutions. And then I will stop talking at you since you've heard a lot of presentations all day. And we can discuss them if you have any questions. The top of that list is a mandate that if insurance companies want to sell home and auto insurance in California, they should be required to sell to Californians and communities who do the right thing and harden their homes, protect their communities from fire. This is so critical to the problems every consumer we talk to faces in the current environment, where they have no reason, other than, of course, it reducing the likelihood that their home will burn down, to invest what could be tens of thousands of dollars into home mitigation, or millions of dollars when we're talking about a neighborhood or community, if their insurance company doesn't have to recognize that and sell to them at the end of the day. So we really need this mandate for coverage for Californians who do the right thing, and there's plenty of precedent for this. We do it in auto insurance, where the auto insurance industry in California must sell to all good drivers. And we do it nationally with Obamacare, where no health insurer can refuse to sell to a consumer based on their pre-existing conditions. So there's lots of precedent for this, and for this working both in California and nationwide. We also need to, as many folks have said, increase state and, I think, insurance industry investment in mitigation. I'm really hopeful that the climate bond will pass and we'll have that $1.5 billion set aside for wildfire mitigation, but we, as everyone has said, we need to invest more in that, and we really believe the insurance industry needs to have some skin in that game. We need a public, transparent catastrophe model, because the biggest problem with what insurance companies are doing right now and what they want to do with increasing rates based on climate in the future is using these models that are completely untransparent, because they're run by private companies. They have a profit motive for keeping that interest secret. We need public data so consumers can gauge their own fire risk, make decisions accordingly, and so we can require that these mitigation decisions be taken into account. We also think we need to disclose reasons for non-renewal and give consumers hard timelines where an insurance company has to respond to an appeal, and that will address some of the technology problems that consumers are facing that are unrelated to wildfires. And when I say consumers, I'm talking about, landlords who own a building that's mitigated and also isn't getting reflection of that in their premiums. And then finally, a larger problem that I'm perhaps not as expert in, but we do really need state level building decisions about where we can and cannot build, because we shouldn't be leaving it to the private insurance industry to decide where Californians can live, especially because the risk has changed so dramatically for Californians who 10 years ago even moved into mountain communities with no idea that it would be anything but a cheap place to retire, and are now faced with this crisis of affordability. So I think I'll just stop sharing and let you all ask any questions if you have them.
Well, that's great. Thank you, Carmen. I appreciate this presentation. I like to look at these solutions. The first one that you mentioned here, require insurers to cover homeowners who reduce risk. Something that Rex Fraser brought up was that he said they had to be taken in a group, that there wasn't, if it was just one mitigation to, say, a home, he says that was not effective in terms of preventing fire. Say it was a wildfire, but it was a number of things. It was based on some sort of study he was talking about. Can you address that and tell us, are we on the same page in terms of what the requirements would be in terms of reducing risk for a homeowner in, let's say, a wildfire-prone area?
So there's a lot of different ways to measure that, right? I guess the first question is, well, is one individual doing it enough? And I think we have to start with the realization that we're not going to prevent wildfire. The best we can do is reduce the risk of, at least when we're talking about the insurance context, the best we can do is make communities safer, make ourselves more resilient, reduce the risk that an individual structure or a town is going to burn down. And so the first thing I will say that it absolutely makes a difference that an individual homeowner takes those steps. The risk of their home burning down is absolutely lower, and the insurance industry acknowledges it. In other contexts, that it is absolutely lower. So we do believe that individual homeowners need that recognition, but I do not dispute that when a community does it, it's even better. And I think one thing that we do not have yet and really desperately need is community-wide standards for what that sort of mitigation resilience looks like. That would be the criteria for them saying insurance companies need to cover this area. There are two measures we have right now that are in fact part of the Safer from Wildfire standards that the State Insurance Commissioner and OES and CAL FIRE and others developed over, I think, a 2-year process. And that is fire-wise communities, which is defined in statute. Fire-safe communities, which is defined in statute, and Firewise USA communities, which is a nonprofit organization that has a set of criteria for communities to meet to certify themselves as fire safe. And those two things are actually part of the State Insurance Commissioner's wildfire mitigation regulations. That's the Safer from Wildfire regulations. And that is, maybe to close it out, that is different than the IBHS certification, which Rex was talking about. I will say, when you combine everything in Safer from Wildfire, and you look at it and compare it to the IBHS certification, they are very, very close. There are a few things that are different, but they're very, very similar, which is part of the reason we're so disappointed that the discounts that consumers are getting under the Safer from Wildfire standard are so low. Because even when you add them all together, some companies are offering 4 or 5% overall discounts, and that pencils out to pennies when you're talking about a consumer who's facing a $10,000 or $12,000 or $15,000 insurance premium.
Well, the cost of doing some of this work is expensive too. I've
Yeah.
talked to a lot of clients that, have had issues. They've spent money doing what they thought was necessary, and then the insurance was still non-renewed. So
I've even
they're in a pickle.
I've even heard people were told to do something specific. They did that, and then the insurance company, said something new. Oh, sorry, we meant you needed to do this. So it's really difficult for homeowners right now. Yeah.
Yeah, and I've been to a lot of wildfires in my district over the years, and it's been really interesting watching ones that did the fire-safe techniques around their home that survived the fire. And every other house in the neighborhood burned down except for the few that took those extra measures. So there's real value in what you're saying there. So I want to open this up to everybody. So why don't we move along here? And Member Vasquez, you have questions? You're good, okay. Chair Lieber.
Well, I just wanted to thank Ms. Balber for hanging in here with us all day long. I know it's been a very lengthy hearing, but I think a really fruitful one. And I very much appreciate your solutions page, because as we're looking forward to a brand-new session in January, this will be helpful for us. And I think we would love to hear from you on an ongoing basis, what you're seeing within the legislature and what the possibilities are, because we definitely hear a lot about this from our constituents. And I think it's even eclipsed Prop 19, which says a lot in terms of the reaction, because everybody from folks who live in restored Victorians in the center of San Francisco to individuals who have retired to less expensive wooded areas, and people who are right in the heart of suburbia are being affected in a very drastic way. And as you mentioned, there currently, for homeowners and property owners, there is no safe harbor. They are still, it's still a game of bring me a rock. And so I'm very interested to see what happens with the new session in terms of some solid ground for consumers to be able to stand on and to get the information that is affecting their lives in such a profound way. And it's not the case that anybody goes to the FAIR plan because they're gaming the system and it's fun and games. People would really much rather have a normal market. And we are going to have more climate disruption in California in the future. And I think obviously the best time to take another look at the insurance industry was probably about 10 years ago. The second best time is in January of this year. And it is really affecting the lives of Californians everywhere. So thank you.
Wonderful. Okay, Deputy Controller Emron.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair Gaines, and I want to thank you, Ms. Carmen, for your presentation today and being a watchdog, a real watchdog, like the BoE is for taxpayers and consumers alike. You know, in your slides, you mentioned Florida, and it's kind of becoming a lesson learned across the nation, especially here in California. Florida's dealing with hurricanes, we're dealing with wildfires, and Florida went through its own transformation process with the insurance company, and it didn't necessarily get to where they wanted to. For example, the insurance company the state of Florida allowed companies to use these probabilistic models. They created 2 taxpayer-supported reinsurance program for insurers. They limited the ability of third parties to sue insurers. They allowed insurers to include reinsurance costs and rates and established a hurricane tax that was passed on to not only policyholders but taxpayers alike. And now we see Florida insurance payments are almost 2-3 times more than it is in California. So my question is as we go through this process, and I've seen former insurance commissioners come out against the plans, much like the consumer watchdog is like, hey, we're handing the keys to the insurance company, letting them drive the car, letting them take the turns, and just kind of complete control. And when you lose that regulation ability, sometimes you can see unintended consequences. So if the state of California and the insurance companies do ink a deal beginning in January 2025. How does the state work to make sure insurance companies are accountable and comply?
Well, I think the two kind of pillars of that are greater accountability for the industry, and the reason we take such issue with what the Department of Insurance is doing on several fronts. Some of the things they've done we're fully supportive of, like the complete rate application, for example. But is the lack of transparency. The problem with these models is not that they're looking at climate risk, but that they're doing it opaquely, and that the modelers have made very clear that they have no interest in disclosing exactly how they're weighing those risks to the public, which is why we're so supportive of a public catastrophe model, because that would bring those decisions out into the open and give consumers access to their own information. And is, the other half of it is, if the commissioner's proposal, as we anticipate, is increasing rates by 50% as soon as those rate increases go into effect, but insurers are dribbling out a few policies here, maybe, to, kind of make it look good that they made their commitments. What do we do for consumers? And that's really where the mandate comes in. And a mandate could be implemented much faster, in order to get folks who have already done everything the state is calling for to harden their homes covered again. One of the ironies is that there are people who are fully, who have met every state standard you can come up with, rebuilt their home in concrete, stuck on the FAIR plan, because insurers have said, sorry, we don't like that zip code. And we could pull those people out of there and help stabilize the market as soon as we put those standards in place.
Understood. And please correct me if I'm wrong here. The consumer watchdog has an issue with the insurance commissioner's plan when it comes to the 85% agreement in distressed areas. And you believe that 85% is not an actual benchmark, rather than it could be 5-10%, and the insurance companies be like, hey, this is just like take it or leave it type, right? And then there's still also a protection gap that exists, even if there is an 85% threshold that's reached.
So on the protection gap issue, this is really important. I kind of shoved it to the end, but the regulation does not specify that the policies insurers are committing to sell are the standard benefit HO3 policies. And this is very specific because the regulation only applies in this context to standard home insurance. It doesn't specify that it has to cover everything that HO3 covers. So it could be instead that bare bones fire policy that the FAIR plan sells. And if that's all consumers are getting, even if insurers met their full commitment, they wouldn't be any better off because they'd just be buying that policy from Allstate instead of the FAIR plan. And there's no reason the rates would be any cheaper. But secondly, unfortunately, the commissioner did not write the rules strongly enough to actually make that 85% any more than a suggestion. And if you really have followed this debate, it's very clear that the reason the department didn't do that is because they wanted the industry to have flexibility to somehow increase coverage around the margins, even if that 85% was, in the insurance company's mind, too burdensome. And so they have made the rule say 85%. It very explicitly says they may instead choose a 5% increase. And then there's this other really nebulous concept of an alternative commitment. So yes, we have a problem with that regulation because it's the one quid pro quo, the one thing consumers were supposed to get out of this deal, and it's not going to hold companies to their promises.
Thank you.
If I could just weigh in on that, that wouldn't preclude the insurance commissioner for acting, though, in the event that things were not proceeding the way he thought they would, right? I mean, he's got regulatory authority, so he could always look back at this if it wasn't working in the interest of consumers, and I think it has to also work in the interest of insurers to make it work. And I think my criticism is on the speed of trying to get this all done. But I think the insurance commissioner is working in good faith in terms of trying to get to a solution. So we'll have to see how this all is borne out in the future, but we clearly have a crisis on our hands. I don't think it's going away. And then it begs the question as to whether we need a catastrophic reinsurance pool, like maybe a state one similar to the Earthquake Authority. I'd like your views on that.
Well, someone mentioned at some point, maybe it was your prior hearing, but I think it was today, that there is a bill that now Congressman Schiff proposed that would create a national reinsurance pool that would essentially be the insurance industry buying reinsurance from the government instead of the private industry. And the reason that is so appealing on the first level is because we have no picture into where these global unregulated reinsurance companies are pegging their premiums. So we would be erasing all of that profit motive from the private industry by having insurers purchase reinsurance from the federal government. But that would need to be coupled in this bill, but also in consumer advocates' mind, with a full benefit policy and guarantees that insurers, so that means not just fire insurance, but earthquake and flood, all of the things that the industry is picking out, so you have to buy 6 insurance policies for your house to be fully covered, and invest in mitigation, because that's what's going to keep us all insured. So Consumer Watchdog is very supportive of that. I think it's a little harder for the state to be that backdrop, but we are the 4th largest insurance market in the world, not the country. And so we have a lot of leverage. It means we could impose a mandate on the industry and they're not going to just turn around and walk. But it also means that we could create some sort of backstop. How that might look would depend on, whether or not we would support it. But something like that coupled with a guarantee that California gets access to coverage is something that should be talked about.
Thank you so much, Carmen. I appreciate it. Carmen Balber, Executive Director, Consumer Watchdog. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I think we are back to our closing remarks. I think this is a wonderful picture of what's happening to the property insurance crisis in the state of California. I want to thank all of our members here at the BoE for the great questions that were asked. I learned a lot just listening to these speakers. I want to thank BoE staff for putting this all together. Our Executive Director, thank you for finding the time slot that would work for us, and my staff, Matt Cox, who is here, and Betsy Hodges. I think in terms of takeaways, I think one that seemed to be pretty evident in my case, at least in the way I'm looking at it, is keeping an eye on what's happening in the legislature and sharing what we've learned here and keeping those lines of communication open in terms of potential solutions. And I'm an individual who likes to bring people together and figure out how you can solve a problem. So if you can bring the players together and figure out a fix, and that's never easy to do, but I think ultimately it's got to work on kind of all fronts so that it's a win-win. And like to just have each of you make closing comments if you're interested.
Thank you. And thank you, Member Gaines, for putting it together, and staff as well. But more, I guess, for a lot of the speakers that joined us today, for their time and their effort, especially several of them that put together real nice PowerPoint presentations because it was easier to follow. And I'm just hoping, I guess, down the road that we maybe get a little bit more input from some of the other stakeholders that, I know there were several others that wanted to participate, but for scheduling reasons couldn't. And I think that'll really help as we begin to look, especially in the new year, for possible legislation that could possibly put a dent, or at least begin the process to solve some of these issues. Because you're right, I think at the end of the day, this is not going away. I think it's only going to get worse. I'm looking at the change in weather up and down the state as I'm driving up and down and going to different events. it's not the same climate we had 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah, I'd love to get, it was Mr. Norwood that said that he attended a seminar on state solutions in terms of what's being done in mitigating the wildfire exposure. So it'd be great to get someone like that. We did try to get CAL FIRE because I thought they could give us an update of like what's happening on the ground. We've actually dodged a couple bullets last year and this year from wildfire exposure. So I think that those might be the seeds that you're discussing for a future informational hearing next year.
Yeah,
Chair
thank
Lieber.
you so much, Mr. Vice Chair, and a big thank you to your staff, who is very helpful and receptive to us, and always thanks to the BoE staff for bearing up to a long hearing. I think it was definitely very vivid and interesting, and gave us a lot of good suggestions that we can be involved in the coming year. To really deliver the benefit to Californians. And that's what this is all about. And I'm so often reminded how we're kind of their first level of defense and an easy spot to come to. So thank you to staff for being that helpful place to come. Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. Deputy Controller Emlyn.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair Gaines, and want to thank your staff as well. It's not easy to put something like this together, so informative. And we've learned about protecting the California dream and what that really means. And part of that dream is home ownership. And with home ownership, you need home insurance to qualify for a mortgage and a mortgage to keep staying in your home. So this all intertwines with the housing crisis we face here and the insurance crisis being so tied in together. So if we don't solve one, we can't solve the other. And I think this board is in a prime position to be real major players in solving this crisis. Full speed ahead into January 2025. I'm very, very interested to see how these regulations play out in the 2025 year, and it's something that we should continue to watch closely as it unravels, because this board's priority is to oversee and overlook taxpayers and their well-being. And I think right now we're in a very slippery slope because the cost of everything is on the rise, and insurance is just adding to that list. And I really believe that if we all put our heads together, it's something that we can control and manage with the right policies and the right ideas. So I'm looking forward to continuing these discussions, and the controller and I both thank you, Vice Chair Gaines, for all your hard work today.
Wonderful. Then we are concluded. Mary, is there anything else we need to do?
Yes, we do.
Okay. I'll turn it back to the chair.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, we'll go ahead and take public comment on the many items that we went through as part of our hearing. And we haven't received any comment cards nor been notified that there's anyone who has submitted written comments to us other than the presenters. And so we'll go to our AT&T moderator. Moderator, could you please let us know if there's anyone who is hoping to make comments on items 3 through 13?
Yes, Madam Chair. Please press 1, then 0 for any comments for 3 through 13. At this time, there are no questions.
Okay, thank you. So we'll go on now to item 14, which is the Executive Director's Report. Ms. Stowers?
Good afternoon, Yvette Stowers. I will be brief. First of all, thank you for a great informational hearing. Learned a lot. Got some new terms. Vice Chair Gaines, as you know, I've been one of those victims of the drive-by drone for non-existent mode. And I paid someone to come to clean my roof, $800 later, and they still did not renew me.
Yeah.
Thank you. I did get someone else. I do pay a little bit more. And I have other colleagues whose condo is going through a similar issue, but her financial problem is much, much greater. So this is very informative. All righty, so what I'm going to talk about today, I'm just going to go over some dates. First of all, We had our annual conference with the California Assessors Association in San Luis Obispo County. That took place on October 7th and 10th, and all members participated in one way or another. It was a great conference. Thank you to the assessors. Another date, last week, October 22nd, I had my annual meeting with the BoE Advisory Council. Very good meeting, very robust conversation, and some very good suggestions coming from my council members. Thank you, council members, for your commitment and BoE success. November 6th to the 8th, California Lawyers Association will hold their annual Tax Bar and Tax Policy Conference in Anaheim, California. As I said last week, Mr. Richard Moon and Ms. Lisa Thompson will be participating. November 7th, my team and I we've been asked to speak at the upcoming California Society of Enrolled Agent 2024 State Tax Agency Liaison Meeting, and this meeting will be virtual. November 14th, Chief Counsel will speak at the County Council Association of California 2024 Fall Taxation Study and Conference. Those are dates. Now, just a reminder, our next meeting, Monday, I don't want to steal your thunder, member, Chair Lieber, but our next meeting is November, and at that meeting is at the time that you have agreed to go over your governor's policy, or at least have suggestions if you want any changes. So I'm asking you I asked by email, and I'm asking again that if you have any suggested changes, please prepare a memo and submit to me in board proceedings by November 6th. That way we have time to get it on the agenda. That concludes my remarks. I'm available for any questions.
Thank you. Any questions for Ms. Towers? Okay, seeing none, thank you so much for all the information. And our last item for today is closing remarks, and then we'll have our adjournment. Anyone have brief closing remarks? Mr. Vasquez.
Mine's more of an adjournment. So you want me to just wait or just do it now?
No, that's fine right now.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes. I'd like to adjourn our meeting today, our session, in honor of our former Los Angeles Dodger pitcher, Fernando Valenzuela, who we lost on October the 22nd, just short of his birthday. He was 62. His death came as the Dodgers were preparing for the World Series, which is kind of ironic. The last time we played him, he was the main state in '81 that turned that series around for us. Valenzuela was one of the most dominant players of this era, widely popular figure, especially among the Latino community throughout California and the country. He was the young man at 20 that started with the Dodgers. Nobody knew that he would ever have the career he did. And he just came from humble beginnings, from a little town in Mexico. He was the youngest of 12 children and came to be a major league ball player that was very well respected by not only the Dodgers, but many of the players throughout the league. At the age of 20, he opened a Major League Baseball season with 8 straight wins, 5 of them being complete shutouts. And, as we're looking at the games these days, nobody even pitches a complete game, much less a shutout. So it was kind of a phenomenon back in the day. And that first year, he not only did he receive the Cy Young Award, but he also was the MVP in the History and Accomplished Facts, and was the Rookie of the Year in '81. And like I said, it was also that same year that they were able to take down New York Yankees, which looks like they might do tonight, in a sweep, which will be a first. And I know we have some New York fans out here listening, but I feel your pain. But at the end of the day, I was fortunate enough to at least attend one of the games on Saturday, Dodger Stadium, and it was so electrifying. I'd never seen so many people, show up and just be so attentive. Kind of reminded me of actually New York when I went to a New York Yankee game. Their fans are very dedicated. You never see them leave early. They stay even if they're losing. They wait until the last pitch, thinking something might change, which almost did. Actually, in our case, it did change on the Friday game with a grand slam, and then almost changed in the other direction on Saturday. But and he, over the years, developed a nickname. They call him El Toro, the bull, for being such a hardworking and determined individual when he was on the mound. He'll be sorely missed. He had the fortune of having a very supportive wife, Linda, who was a school teacher from Mexico. We married back in '81, and he's left behind his sons, Fernando Jr., Ricky, his daughters, Linda, Maria, as well as 7 grandchildren. I had the opportunity to meet him several years ago, and then most recently, he was also an avid golfer, and I used to bump into him a lot at one of the clubs out in Montebello. But when Jaime Jardín, who was the big announcer for the Dodgers, was there as part of his retirement, we had an opportunity to have a good conversation with Fernando, not knowing that he was fighting an illness, which later took his life, as a young man. But he'll be sorely missed. And I know he's probably looking down at us right now, watching the World Series as it unfolds. So, and that, I would just like to close in honor of his, not only his life, but his memories as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vasquez, and we really appreciate you raising the name of Fernando Valenzuela here. He was a true Californian, a sportsman and a gentleman as well. So thank you so much. Mr. Emron.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank everyone again for a very, very pleasant day. And I'd like to adjourn in the memory of 2 military officers who were killed in a crash on Tuesday, October 15th over Mount Rainier in Washington State. Lieutenant Commander Lindsey P. Evans and Lieutenant Serena N. Wildman, both 31-year-old Navy flight officers. They were in an accident in a Growler jet over Mount Rainier, and unfortunately, they went from a search and rescue to a recover. They were recently deployed in the Middle East and were back in the United States for training. And they actually both participated in the first ever 2023 all-female flyover at the Super Bowl, NFL Super Bowl. And they're both trailblazers in their own right. And they're actually both women flew combat missions in the Middle East, marking the first time that one of the first times that women were flying combat missions over land. So to celebrate 50 years of women flying in the Navy, it's a very tragic accident. Both women were from California as well. So I want to pay tribute to them in a very tragic accident, especially after coming home from a deployment. So may they rest in peace and may God bless our troops. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Emron, and we really appreciate you raising the names of the 2 service members, Evans and Wildman. And I think they're really a great example of American excellence and Californian excellence as well. Thank you so much. And Vice Chair.
If I could just adjourn in memory of Scott Grigsby, attended his memorial service last week, and he was a member of the community, lived in El Dorado County. He was in the labeling business with his parents. His parents had sold, he worked in the business for a dozen years. They had sold the business actually to, I believe, Gallo. And he got into the labeling business after, I think there was a period of time he couldn't compete. And he got back into the business himself and grew that business dramatically. But he had a very unexpected death. He had pancreatitis. He was 53 years old, father and grandfather, and just a great guy. He was like the life of the party. And he checked into the hospital here in Sacramento and contracted an infection, which later turned into a second infection. He went to the Bay Area, was treated at a hospital down there, and never came out of the hospital. He passed away after 61 days. So just want to adjourn in his memory and recognize him for the great father, grandfather, and individual he was. So thank you.
Thank you. And if you would please convey the board's condolences to the Grigsby family, that would mean a
Absolutely.
lot. Thank you. And members, I just wanted to add that I did receive some language from Mr. Schaefer on the definitional issue that he raised earlier today. So since we don't have that on our agenda, we can't talk about it here, but we'll definitely follow up and do the appropriate context out of that. So I want to thank all the members and all the staff for hanging in with us. And we will now adjourn the board meeting. Our next meeting is November 19th and 20th, 2024, here at the Maley State Office Complex in Sacramento. Thank you for joining us.